Hello and welcome to Slow Sleep Stories. Thanks. Before you get comfortable, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Let us know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there now. Turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let's start this journey together tonight. The story is beginning to unfold now. Let's begin. Leo Martin was the kind of man you might not notice twice, and that suited him just fine. In a quiet town that sat somewhere between here and there in Ohio, Leo had long ago settled into a life that barely rippled. He lived in a small house with chipping white paint, a crooked mailbox, and a wraparound porch that creaked more than it stood. But it was tidy, and in spring, the window boxes always bloomed with something bright, always marigolds. Leo was 73, mostly retired, and officially between hobbies, according to himself. He drank lukewarm tea out of a thermos that smelled slightly of peppermints, walked the same 3 blocks every morning, and waved at every squirrel like it was a neighbor. People in town knew him loosely Mr. Martin from the library board, the man who wore suspenders even in July, the one who once lost a boot in the town fountain trying to rescue a pigeon. Yes, that Leo. But a change began, slowly and softly, like the first stretch of dawn against a curtain. It started on a Monday in May, which no one found remarkable except Leo, because he had chosen that day on purpose. He woke up, buttoned his best flannel, and carried a small box under his arm. Inside were marigold seeds, carefully wrapped in wax paper. Leo walked to the bus stop across from the bakery. It was a plain wooden bench beside a tired oak tree and a trash can with a wobbly lid. He knelt slowly, his knees crackling like newspaper, and with a garden trowel from his garage, dug a shallow patch along the base of the bench. He worked in silence, except for the occasional satisfied grunt. A young couple passed by with a stroller. The man nodded. Leo nodded back. No questions, no explanation, just soil, seeds, and an old man with all the time in the world. 3 days later, small green shoots poked through the dirt. By the following week, tiny orange blossoms danced every time a bus rumbled past. Leo returned each morning with his thermos and a quiet pride. He'd sit across the street under the bakery awning, pretending to read a newspaper that was 4 days old. He watched people come and go. Some noticed the flowers, some didn't, but now and then someone smiled at Leo, counted that dot. What no one knew was that Leo had a box in his garage labeled "Stops," written in block letters with a black marker. Inside were folded sheets, each one a hand-drawn map of a bus stop around town. Notes in the margins: south-facing bench, gets good light. Mrs. Alvarez walks her dog here, needs cleanup. The plan was simple: plant, water, wait. He didn't tell anyone, not because he was secretive, but because, in Leo's mind, this was not newsworthy. This was just a thing that needed doing. The second bus stop came 2 weeks later, next to the community center. It was a little trickier, more foot traffic, fewer squirrels, but he managed. Then the third, tucked behind the post office, and the fourth, at the edge of the park, where the benches were crooked and the roof was missing 2 shingles. It was the quietness of the work that suited Leo. The early mornings, the soft scrape of trowel against dirt, the occasional whistle of wind, and the reliable squawk of a blue jay who seemed suspicious of gardening. He named her Rita. Leo didn't know that the mail carrier, Carla, was watching. She thought he was just tidying up. She was the first to mention it to someone else. "You've seen those flowers showing up near the buses. I think it's that old man with the thermos." That's how it began. whispers soft and harmless, like warm wind through screen doors. But Leo, he just kept planting. He kept track in a little blue notebook labeled Bloom Log. It was filled with tidy handwriting, drawings of petals, and the occasional reminder, like don't forget to water the one near the library. Or remember, squirrels don't eat marigolds, but they sure like digging. There was, of course, the occasional obstacle. One morning, Leo arrived at the park bench to find his flowers trampled by a particularly enthusiastic game of freeze tag. He sighed, knelt down, and replanted. No blame, just dirt and do-overs. He once dropped an entire packet of seeds into a storm drain and simply laughed for 5 full seconds. Guess that stops getting creative, he murmured. Every now and then, a stranger would stop to ask what he was doing. Leo would smile, shrug, and say, just brightening things up a bit. Then he'd offer them a seed. Sometimes they took it. Sometimes they asked what kind of flower. Marigolds, he'd say, as if they were the only flower in the world. And to Leo, maybe they were. They were cheerful, resilient, a bit wild, and unbothered by imperfection. They didn't need much to thrive. Neither did he. One morning, while crouched at a particularly stubborn patch near the hardware store, a small girl tapped his shoulder. She had a juice box in one hand and a plush unicorn dragging behind her. "Are you the flower grandpa?" she asked. Leo blinked, smiled. "I might be." She nodded solemnly and said, "Good job," then skipped away. That was the first time. Leo felt like something was really happening. Like maybe, just maybe, people were starting to see, but it didn't change his pace. Slow, deliberate, joyful, the way marigolds bloom one petal at a time. It was around the 8th bus stop when things began to shift in a way Leo hadn't planned. Not that he ever had much of a plan beyond what his bloom log told him, but up until that point, his little flower mission had felt entirely his. Own a quiet secret shared between him and the soil. The trouble, or perhaps, the magic began at the stop in front of the high school. Leo knew it would be a gamble. Teenagers, by reputation, weren't known for reverence toward delicate orange blossoms, but he chose the spot anyway because it had excellent morning sun and the bench always looked so lonely. He arrived before sunrise, a folded towel to kneel on and a thermos steaming with peppermint tea. As he worked, the street lights buzzed softly above. He could hear the buzz of cicadas giving way to the chirps of waking birds. He hummed quietly, something he couldn't place, perhaps from the radio or from long ago. By the time the first student walked past, headphones on, eyes lowered, Leo was smoothing the last handful of dirt around his freshly planted marigolds. He didn't look up, just gave a small, satisfied nod to the ground and muttered, "Grow." Well, but something happened that morning. A small group of students, noticing the flowers on their afternoon walk home, took pictures. One even crouched to sniff the blossoms, which had opened quickly in the early summer sun. By dinner, a blurry photo was on the local high school's social media page. The caption read, "Shout out to whoever is planting sunshine at our bus stop." Leo didn't know this, of course. He didn't have a smartphone. His phone was a flip model that lived in a kitchen drawer, under a stack of coupons and one battery-less flashlight. But the town noticed. The bakery girl told the librarian, who told the pastor, who mentioned it in passing during a sermon about small acts of kindness. Before long, it was that flower man and the marigold mystery on everyone's tongue. And Leo just bought more seeds. He started carrying 2 thermoses, one for tea and one for water. He fashioned a belt from an old dog leash to hold his trowel. He found a sun hat in the attic that made him look like a lopsided beekeeper, but he wore it proudly. People began to wave more. Cars honked in a gentle, Midwestern kind of way. A woman on a bike once dropped a granola bar in his lap and said, "For energy, dear." He didn't much like granola, but appreciated the gesture. One morning, as Leo crouched behind a bench near the old train depot, he heard footsteps approach. He didn't look up, assuming it was another early commuter. "Hey," said a young voice. "Do you do this everywhere?" Leo sat back on his heels. A teenage boy stood there, hoodie zipped to the neck despite the summer heat. He had that unsure look of someone who wasn't used to speaking first. Leo smiled, trying to. The boy looked at the marigolds. "They're kind of nice. That's the idea." The boy hesitated, then kicked the dirt gently with one. "Sneaker, can I help?" Leo paused. Then he extended the trowel, handle first. From that morning on, it wasn't just Leo at first. It was a different helper each week. A student, a bus driver, the woman who owned the diner and wore perfume that smelled like cinnamon. They'd show up, sometimes without a word, and dig or water, or just sit beside him while he worked. He wrote all their names, or at least descriptors in the bloom log: girl with skateboard, orange laces, man in overalls, offered gum, high ponytail, hummed off-key. By the time he reached the 15th stop, Leo began leaving behind small handwritten signs. "Enjoy the blooms, planted with care." He signed them LM, which someone eventually guessed stood for local magician, and the name stuck for a week. It was during one of his walks between stops that he heard the most curious thing. Two older women, arms full of groceries, were chatting near the bus stop by the dentist's office. "I heard it's part of a city project," one said. No, I'm telling you, it's that man with the overalls. He used to be a florist in Chicago." Leo, walking slowly behind them, gave a small smile. He'd never even been to Chicago, but he liked the sound of it. At home, he made himself a peanut butter and banana sandwich, sat on his porch swing, and watched a hummingbird inspect the hanging basket. He chuckled softly. City project. If they only knew. Still, it wasn't the praise that warmed Leo's chest. It was the shared smiles, the gentle hands joining his work, the sense that maybe, just maybe, people were looking up more, noticing at bus stop 22, a young girl in a wheelchair rolled up beside him. "I saw you on the news," she said. Leo blinked. "I was on the news. Yeah, my mom showed me. You're famous." "Well," Leo said, "that's something." The girl tilted her head. "Why marigolds?" He thought for a moment. "Because they're bright, but not flashy, strong but soft, and because they remind me of someone who." Leo didn't answer right away. He looked at the freshly planted patch and gently pressed the soil with the back of his hand. Someone who used to believe little things made big differences. The girl smiled, cool, and just like that, she was off. The sun dipped lower. That evening, casting gold across the town, Leo lingered at the bus stop a little longer, watching shadows stretch across the sidewalk. Behind him, the marigolds swayed in the soft breeze just enough to be noticed. By mid-June, Leo had developed a rhythm as natural as the seasons. He woke with the birds, though he suspected the birds, slept in later than he didn't, brewed his tea with ritual precision. One scoop of loose peppermint leaves, a splash of honey, and just enough time for the scent to drift into the hallway and make his kitchen smell like a garden itself. Each morning, he packed his little cart, a creaky contraption once meant for groceries, now rigged with two small wheels, a fold-out stool, and a flag that read, optimistically, on a bloom mission. Bus stop by bus stop, Leo worked his way deeper into town. Each location a new canvas. Some stops were simple, a patch of dusty earth begging for life. Others required more finesse, crack in concrete he filled with potting soil, or planters scrounged from garage sales and painted bright blue. He didn't speak much while he worked, but he smiled, always smiled. That seemed to be enough. One morning, as Leo reached bus stop 35, the one beside the laundromat, where dryers always rumbled and someone inevitably smoked menthols, he found something unexpected. The marigolds were already planted. At first, he thought he'd simply forgotten. Maybe he'd done it the night before. He consulted the bloom log. No entry. Then he saw it, a tiny sign tucked into the mulch. "Keep growing. We've got your back." It was signed with a little doodle of a bee. Leo sat on the bench and laughed softly, so as not to disturb the blossoms. The breeze that morning smelled of warm soap and cigarette smoke, oddly comforting in combination. He sipped his tea and wrote in the bloom log, "Reinforcements have arrived." The next few stops brought more surprises. A cluster of violets appeared beside his marigolds at bus stop 39. A woman left tiny pinwheels next to each flower bed. At stop 42, someone had installed a little painted rock with the message, "You make mornings softer." It was then that Leo realized he was no longer the sole gardener. The town had joined in. End, as if summoned by his own realization. A woman with silver-streaked hair and an armful of daffodil bulbs approached him the following day. "You started this?" she asked, one eyebrow raised like a challenge. Leo looked up from his trowel, hands dusty and knees stiff. "I suppose I did. Well, I think we've all caught the itch. I brought extras." She gestured at the bulbs. "You plant marigolds. I'm going to sneak in some daffodils. Let's make it a mixed bouquet." Leo chuckled. "The more, the merrier." She introduced herself as Rhonda, a retired music teacher, with a fondness for jazz and garden gloves with polka dots. They worked in a kind of sync that didn't require many words, just the occasional shared grin or elbow bump when they both reached for the watering can. By July, it had become a movement. People left seed packets in Leo's mailbox, Ineas, cosmos, sunflowers. Children scribbled thank you notes on construction paper, often misspelling marigold in endearing ways. "Marigolds are my favorite." One note had glitter that refused to come off his fingers for days. He didn't mind. At stop 50, a group of bus drivers presented Leo with a t-shirt that read, "Bus Stop Botanist." They even held a tiny ceremony. One driver brought cupcakes. Another played a ukulele. Leo, red in the face, gave a short speech that mostly involved the phrase, "Well, I'll be darned." But perhaps the most surprising gift came at stop 53. A young woman, 20s, maybe, with a camera slung round her neck, sat on the bench as Leo approached. She looked up from her sketchpad and smiled. "Been trying to catch you," she said. "You're fast." Leo shrugged. "I do my best." "I'm Ellie," she said. "I'm a grad student. I'm working on a photo project about kindness. I heard about you from a bus driver named Gus." Leo chuckled. "Gus talks more than my radio." Ellie smiled. "May I take your picture?" Leo hesitated. Cameras had never been his favorite. They captured too much and too little, all at once. But Ellie waited, quiet and patient, like someone asking for a secret without demanding it. "All right," he said finally, "but only if you catch my good side." She took 3, one with his trowel, one crouched beside the blooms, and one where he was laughing, caught mid-chuckle by something she'd said about squirrels wearing tiny tool belts. She promised to send him prints, and true to her word, they arrived in the mail a week later. wrapped in tissue paper and smelling faintly of cinnamon. Leo pinned one to his fridge. It showed him squinting in the sun, hat askew. Marigolds blooming brightly around his feet. He looked ... happy that night. As crickets began their lullaby and stars blinked sleepily into view, Leo sat on his porch with a blanket draped over his knees. He thought about how it had started just a man, a trowel, and a stubborn belief that flowers could make bus stops friendlier. He sipped his tea from the corner of his yard. The wind chime tinkled a sound soft and scattered like laughter. Underwater Leo smiled, and the blooms kept growing. The town fair arrived in August, as it always did, humming with the scent of popcorn and the shuffle of flip-flops over grass. Booths lined the park's gravel paths, selling everything from crocheted potholders to homemade pickles and music. Drifted gently from the bandstand, like it knew not to be too loud, Leo hadn't planned on going. Crowds weren't really his thing, and besides, his marigolds wouldn't plant themselves. But Rhonda insisted. "You've earned a night off," she said, hands on hips. The universal stance of someone who knows they'll win the argument. Leo gave in, mostly because she'd already bought him a funnel cake. They strolled the fairgrounds together, sipping sweet tea from paper cups. Leo wore his bus stop botanist t-shirt, and it drew more attention than he expected. "Hey, you're the flower guy," someone called, waving from the piting contest. "My kids look for your blooms every morning," said a woman with a lemonade stand. "They think you're some kind of bus stop wizard." Leo smiled and nodded, unused to the spotlight, but warmed by it all the same. It was like realizing your shadow had become a mural while you weren't looking at one booth. A group of third graders displayed hand-painted tiles. In the corner of the table stood a small sign inspired by Leo's flowers. Each tile had a bloom marigolds, mostly, but also daisies, tulips, and in one case, a cactus with a face. Leo paused. "That one looks suspiciously like me," he said. The girl behind the table grinned. "It is you. You're wearing your gardening hat." He bought it for $3 and a button. He paid with $4. Later that evening, the mayor took the stage. In front of the gazebo, Mike squealing slightly before settling into a hush. Leo was halfway through a snow cone when she called his name. "We have a new tradition to celebrate tonight," she said, thanks to one citizen's quiet devotion to beauty, kindness, and a brighter morning commute. Leo stood, reluctantly, the kind of man who preferred daisies to dais. They presented him with a certificate, honorary town gardener, and a small golden trowel that shimmered like it had stories of its own. The crowd applauded gently, the kind of applause you give at weddings or when babies take their first cautious steps. Rhonda elbowed him. "You're practically a local legend now." Leo blushed so deeply he matched the cherry syrup on his snow cone. That night, as they walked home through the sleepy streets, Leo noticed something new. People had begun planting flowers in their own yards, not just marigolds, but every color of the rainbow. Little handwritten signs read things like "Bloom where you wait" or "This stop brought to you by joy." He didn't say much, but his heart was full, and that was enough. Back at home, he poured himself a cup of chamomile tea, sat in his favorite chair, and flipped open the bloom log. Tonight's entry was simple. Even the fair smelled like flowers. He scribbled a quick sketch of the golden trowel and underlined it twice the next day. The town's weekly newsletter arrived in his mailbox, printed on peach-colored paper that curled slightly at the edges. Right on the front, under the headline, "Bloom Boom," was a photo of Leo Midlaff, surrounded by children and marigolds. The caption read, "Leo Nix, planting peace, one petal at a time." He cut it out and pinned it next to Ellie's photos on the fridge. The two images sat side by side, one candid, one printed, both bright with color. That week, Leo reached bus stop 60. It stood near a quiet cul-de-sac where the pavement always held onto the sun's warmth just a little too long. There, someone had painted the bench. It was now a cheerful turquoise with stenciled daisies along the backrest. A note was taped beneath. It, in a child's handwriting, "Dear Flower Man, I'm 8 and I have asthma, but I love waiting here now because it smells like happiness. Thank you." Leo didn't cry, not really. He just blinked a lot. He reached into his cart and added an extra scoop of soil, just for good measure. Then he whispered to the marigolds, "Let's make this the best one yet." That evening, the sky turned the color of ripe peaches and watermelons, and Leo's front yard seemed to glow in reply. He set out a little solar lantern beside his mailbox, just in case someone dropped off seeds after dark and before going to bed. He stood barefoot on his porch, tea in hand, breathing in the deep hush of summer in the distance. A bus wheezed to a halt. He imagined someone stepping off and smiling. At a bed of marigolds they hadn't expected. Maybe they were tired. Maybe they had a hard day. Maybe they'd pick one and tuck it behind their ear. Leo didn't know. But the thought made his heart bloom just a little. The rain came on a Thursday, gentle as a lullaby, not the dramatic kind that storms in and claps with thunder, but the sort that quietly drapes the town in gray and makes everything smell like wet bark and cool soil. Leo welcomed it. Rain meant the marigolds could rest too. He didn't water them on days like this nature had. It covered instead used the time for indoor gardening, which was really just a fancy way of saying he alphabetized his seed packets and dusted the leaves. Of his potted ferns, he was kneeling on his kitchen floor, trying to remember whether milkweed went under M or W, when he heard the knock. 3 short taps. Leo opened the door to find a soggy teenager holding a lunchbox and a confused golden doodle. "Hi," the girl said, wiping her glasses. "Are you the flower guy?" "I might be," Leo said, tilting his head, "unless it's someone else wearing these socks." He pointed down. His socks were bright yellow and dotted with tiny smiling suns. She giggled. "You helped my sister with the bus stop on Maple. It's nice now. She used to cry before school, but now she looks for caterpillars instead." Leo stepped aside and invited her in. Tea. She nodded. Her name was Morgan, and she had questions. Lots of them. How deep do you plant marigolds? Do they really keep bugs away? What happens if you accidentally water them with Gatorade? Leo answered each one patiently, sprinkling in a few odd facts like how marigolds used to be called Mary's gold in medieval Europe and were once thought to heal bee stings. Morgan pulled out a notebook and started writing. "This is for a school project," she said. "We're supposed to interview a local expert." Leo laughed. "I don't know if I'm an expert. I just like flowers more than most people like TV." That earned him a snort. They spent the afternoon potting small marigolds in reused yogurt cups and giving them names. Morgan named hers Cheryl after her history teacher. Leo named his Todd because he looked like he knew a good joke but wasn't telling it yet. By dinner time, the rain had stopped. The golden doodle had claimed the doormat, and Morgan had drawn a cartoon version of Leo with a cape made of petals and the words Captain Bloom under it. "You should be in the paper again," she said. Leo shrugged. "I'd settle for someone remembering to water Cheryl." Before she left, Morgan handed him a thank you card. Inside was a tiny packet of seeds labeled Mystery Mix. Leo taped it to his fridge. That night, he dreamed he was planting flowers on the moon. Each marigold floated a few inches above the soil, like it couldn't quite make up its mind whether to land. He wore a space helmet and Crocs. Ellie floated past, waving a tiny watering can. He woke up smiling. The next morning, he set out for bus stop 61. It was tucked between an old ice cream shop and a fire station, and the bench there had a wobble in one leg that made it feel like it might gallop off at any moment. He patched the dirt, fluffed the mulch, and planted Todd. Then, he added a sign, painted in delicate cursive, "Welcome to the wobbly stop. Please mind your seat and smell the flowers." He paused and added a doodle of a flower on a skateboard. As he packed up, the fire chief stepped out with a mug of coffee. "You the one doing all this?" he asked, nodding toward the marigolds. Leo nodded. "My crews started calling you the Bloom Bandit," the chief said. "We've been trying to guess what route you'll strike next." Leo grinned. "Tell them to check their own sidewalk tomorrow." As he walked home, the town seemed to lean in closer. Not louder, just more curious. People waved more. Windows stayed open longer. Sidewalk chalk lingered even after the rain. That week, Leo received 7 handwritten notes, 2 drawings, and a donation of 37 ceramic gnomes, all left. Anonymously on his porch, he arranged the gnomes into a tiny audience near his front steps. They faced the flower beds like they were watching a slow, fragrant play. Rhonda walked by and stopped. "You've got fans," she said. "I think one of them winked." Leo replied. She laughed, and Leo added a small marigold crown to the tallest gnome. The mailbox became a story of its own. Inside it were envelopes addressed to Mr. Bloom, Plant Man, and once simply Dirt Hero. Most of them were from children letters about pets, school, and whether marigolds could survive in a sock drawer. He answered every single one, sometimes in rhyme, sometimes with seeds taped inside, sometimes just with a simple thanks for noticing the small things. That's where the magic hides. The first time Leo saw the headline, he was in the checkout line at the corner grocery, the mysterious man making bus stops bloom underneath. A picture of his elbow. It was unmistakably his elbow. He recognized the freckle, shaped like the state of Vermont, but still, he blinked at it like it might change into someone else's limb if he stared long enough. Rhonda, in line behind him, leaned over his shoulder. "Well, well," she said, grinning. "You're famous." Leo flushed the color of overripe tomatoes. Only if elbows count. He bought 2 pints of blueberries and the paper, though he didn't read the article until he was back home, with tea steeping and the cat curled like a question mark near his feet. The piece was kind, even poetic in spots. It described how dozens of bus stops across the county had quietly transformed dead patches of grass, turned vibrant with life. Each spot lined with cheerful marigolds and tidy signs. No graffiti, no weeds, just unexpected beauty. The journalist dubbed him the bus stop botanist. Leo winced. He thought it made him sound like someone who gave lectures on moss. Still, he clipped the page and pinned it above his desk, next to a crayon drawing of Captain Bloom Morgan had given him. After the article, things changed not dramatically, but like someone had turned the volume up just a notch on the town's heartbeat. A hardware store offered him a discount on mulch. A local bakery left sugar cookies, shaped like tiny spades, on his doorstep. One day, he came outside to find a group of Girl Scouts planting petunias at a bench he hadn't gotten to yet. They waved when they saw him and said, "We're on Team Flower." He didn't quite know what to say to that, so he handed them 3 packets of zinnias and said, "Welcome aboard." And then there was the invitation, folded in pale yellow cardstock, tucked between his electric bill and a coupon for ant spray. We cordially invite Leo Talbot to speak at the annual Spring Festival on the topic of community kindness. Leo read it twice, then flipped it over, as if the back might say, "Just kidding." He hadn't spoken in front of a crowd since high school, when he'd read a poem about oranges and promptly fainted into the principal. Still, something about the card made him smile. Maybe it was the embossed daisies on the border. He said yes. The week before the event, he practiced in the mirror, then to the cat, then to the ceramic gnomes, who listened with grave expressions. His speech was short, nothing fancy, just a few thoughts about dirt and kindness and how small things can bloom big dot when the day came. Leo wore his second best shirt and socks with tiny watering cans on them. The crowd wasn't huge, but it filled the town hall with warmth. People brought flowers in jam jars. The mayor wore a tie with tulips on it. Even the ice cream truck showed up, serving something called pedal swirl. Leo stepped up to the microphone, took a deep breath, and began. Some people plant trees for the future. I plant marigolds for Monday mornings. The room quieted. He told stories about Ellie's love for puns, about finding caterpillars at stop 33, about the day Morgan gave him a seed packet marked mystery mix. He ended with this: kindness doesn't have to be big. Sometimes it's a bloom by a bench, a smile on a sidewalk, a note in a mailbox. You never know who needed it, but it's always worth it. The applause startled him. It went on longer than he expected. The cat would have hated it. Afterward, a man approached him with watery eyes. "You planted flowers at my granddaughter's bus stop," he said. "She says it makes her feel safe." Leo nodded, speechless. Later that evening, walking home with a leftover cupcake in his pocket, Leo paused at one of his earliest stops. The flowers were thriving. A painted stone sat under the bench that read, "Bloom where you catch the bus." He chuckled. That sounded like Ellie. That night, Leo didn't dream of the moon or space crocs. He dreamed of benches blooming on their own, of shy tulips waving, at buses and daisies holding hands. In the morning, he found a thank you note tucked under his doormat. Inside was a hand-drawn map of the town, with every marigold stop marked in a bright yellow star. At the bottom it said, "Just so you know how far you've grown." Leo looked at the map, then out the window, where the marigolds swayed like a crowd of sleepy suns. He smiled. He had a new packet of seeds, a fresh thermos of tea, and 59 benches left to visit. Time to get to work. By midsummer, Leo's marigold roots had become more than just flower-lined benches. They'd become quiet rituals for the people who passed through them. Somewhere between routine and reverence, those small golden blossoms were helping strangers become neighbors. Each morning, just as the dew clung to the petals like tiny glass buttons, Leo wheeled out his wagon, still squeaky on the left side, still smelling faintly of mint and compost, and began his rounds. He didn't always work alone now. Some mornings, Mrs. Winslow would shuffle along beside him, offering unsolicited critiques about his choice of border plants. "Too spiky," she'd say about the salvia. "Not dreamy enough for public transport." On Tuesdays, one of the high school art students, Emilio, would show up with spray paint and stencils to decorate the curbs with soft, swirly florals or quotes like "Pause here, bloom later." But Leo's favorite companion was Morgan, the little girl who'd once handed him the Captain Bloom drawing. She had taken to biking behind him on a too small pink cruiser with tassels that fluttered like jellyfish in the wind. One morning, as they stopped at the corner of Vine and Oak, she asked, "Do the flowers talk to you too?" Leo, who had just been telling the zinnias they were doing a splendid job staying upright, cleared his throat. "Sometimes they hum," he whispered. Morgan nodded solemnly. Yeah, mine, mostly gossip. One of the newer stops was outside a small senior center Leo's doing, of course. He'd noticed the bench had no shade and decided it needed not just flowers, but a whole canopy of kindness. With the help of some volunteers, he built a tiny trellis arch and planted sweet peas to curl over it. He added a little bell chime that sang when the breeze passed through. The seniors took notice. Soon, a group of them began sitting there every afternoon, gossiping like the flowers, playing checkers, and offering unsolicited romantic advice to any teenager who walked past. They think this is the kissing stop now, Morgan informed him one day, giggling because one couple held hands here for 5 seconds. Leo sighed, scandalous. But the stop outside the library had grown especially dear to him, not because of the view or the light, but because of what began appearing in the flower beds. Little notes tucked behind stems, folded carefully and pressed under rocks. Not litter, not discarded, but left intentionally. They were handwritten, sweet and short, usually unsigned. Things like, "You're doing your best, that's enough. The world is better because you're in it. It's okay to sit for a while." Leo started collecting them in a small box labeled Petal Mail. He didn't know who was writing them mad first. He thought it might be one of the teachers at the school, but the handwriting varied too much. It seemed that the town had caught his habit of quiet generosity and decided to speak back. There was even a moment one quiet evening, just after a rainwind, he found a laminated card nestled in the marigolds at stop 42. It read, "To the gardener," with the elbow in the paper. "Thank you for reminding me to breathe." He sat on the bench after that for a long time, letting the scent of wet earth and marigolds wash over him like a lullaby. Evenings were now Leo's favorite. Once the last bus had sighed its way down Main Street and the sky had dipped into sherbet shades of pink and blue, he'd make his last round with a watering can and a flashlight. On one such evening, he noticed something new someone had added to his work. At 3 stops in a row, small handmade signs had been staked next to the flower beds. Each one read, "This bench is part of the Marigold route. Sit, breathe, bloom." The last one had a tiny drawing of Captain Bloom arms akimbo, cape fluttering. Leo chuckled so hard he nearly dropped the watering can. He didn't know who had made the signs, but he had a feeling. He found Morgan the next day drawing on the sidewalk, with chalk, surrounded by a squad of her friends. "Nice signage work," he said casually. Morgan beamed. "We're the Marigold League now. We do branding." "Oh," Leo said, deadpan. "Do I need a membership card?" "No," she replied, "but you have to wear a flower pin. We made you one." She handed him a crooked badge made of felt and sequins. It was entirely too sparkly. It was perfect. Leo pinned it to his shirt and continued his route. The marigolds, it seemed, were no longer just his. They belonged to the town now. They belonged to the students, the gossipy seniors, the tired commuters, the kids on bikes. They were stitched into the fabric of daily life, like smile lines or the smell of cookies in a good bakery. That night, Leo wrote his first note. He tucked it behind a sunflower at the quietest stop. It read, "The bench is just a bench, but you're blooming." Leo awoke the next morning to a breeze that smelled like warm pavement and something sweet, maybe honeysuckle, maybe just hope. He had the day off, or at least he tried to pretend he did. But his fingers itched for the trowel and his brain kept making mental maps of which marigolds might need pinching or which vines might be plotting rebellion. So instead, he wandered. No wagon, no gloves, just a stroll. The first bench he passed was already occupied by a teenager, sketching in a spiral-bound notebook, legs curled up under her. She nodded at him. Her pencil kept moving. The marigolds at her feet were blooming like buttercups, golden and full of sleepy pride. Looking good, Leo whispered to them. The girl raised an eyebrow. He kept walking. At the third stop, he found a small paper cup wedged into the back of the bench. Taped to it was a note that read, "Take a bloom, leave a smile." Inside, someone had placed 3 marigold heads, a daisy, and somehow a piece of spearmint gum. It wasn't the worst bouquet he'd ever seen. This little act of rebellion touched something in Leo's chest. He sat down. Across the street, he watched a man pause, glance both ways, then dart across traffic to gently water the marigolds outside a taco truck. It wasn't Leo's stop, but someone had taken it upon themselves. He didn't know if the marigold route had an end. Perhaps it looped around the town like a lasso, or spiraled inward like a shell. Perhaps it didn't need to end at all. Back at his own home, the mailbox had something unexpected inside. A card, not junk, not bills. A card on the front. Someone had drawn a tiny version of his wagon, marigolds tumbling out behind it like fireflies. Inside, in curly green ink, it said, "Thank you for planting peace, one stop at a time." No signature, no return. Address. He placed the card on the kitchen windowsill, next to the pepper plant he kept forgetting to water. Later that week, Leo received a phone call from the city council. He braced himself. Some complaint about sidewalk clutter or a bylaws violation, perhaps. But the voice on the other end was gentle and a little amused. "We'd like to officially designate the Marigold route as part of the city's beautification program," she said. "Also, would you be willing to be the Grand Marshal of the Harvest Parade this year? We've had several requests." Leo blinked. "Does the Grand Marshal have to wear a sash?" "No," she said, "but we do have a custom watering can for you." "I'll think about it," he replied, though the answer was already yes. On the morning of the parade, Leo stood at the front of the line, holding a shiny metal watering can, painted with vines, and a very flattering cartoon version of himself, complete with a heroic JAWLINE. Morgan and the Marigold League Road just behind him in a float shaped like a giant flower pot. The seniors waved wildly from their own bench-themed float, pelting the crowd with soft orange petals and laughing like kids. As the procession passed each bus stop, people clapped not for the floats, not for the parade, but for the benches, for the flowers, for the magic stitched into sidewalks and morning routines. That evening, after the confetti had been swept up and the last funnel cake had been consumed, Leo took a quiet walk through town. At every stop, he saw little traces of joy. A drawing tucked under a stone, a new bloom in a coffee cup, a couple holding hands, a teenager helping an elder up from the bench, a bus driver humming gently while waiting for late passengers at stop 34. He sat. He let out a long breath. It was the kind of breath you take when you're not just tired, but full. The kind of breath that reminds you you're alive, and that for once, maybe that's enough. The marigolds nodded in the breeze like old friends, somewhere a bus side, and pulled away. And Leo closed his eyes, not to sleep, not quite, but to rest, to listen, to be still for just a little longer. The Marigold route would continue, with or without him. But tonight, it paused, right here, as the final petals fall along the Marigold route. We leave Leo where he has always belonged, somewhere between one quiet bench and the next, tending to the everyday magic that most of us forget to notice. His journey wasn't about grand gestures or accolades. though they came eventually. It was about the simple, steady act of choosing to care every morning, every marigold, every stop. It began with a newspaper elbow and a pocket full of seeds. It ended with a town blooming not just with flowers, but with kindness. Leo never set out to become a local legend or a symbol of hope. He just wanted to make waiting less boring, less lonely. He succeeded in making it beautiful. Now the flowers are being tended by new hands. Children who once watched from the bus window now kneel beside the garden beds. Commuters bring their own tools, their own colors. Notes appear like whispered affirmations from strangers to strangers. And somewhere, a girl on a pink bicycle still patrols the route with a Captain Bloom badge on her backpack. What Leo planted wasn't just marigolds. It was the idea that something small and lovely could live quietly among us, asking nothing but giving everything. So tonight, as you turn down the covers and close your eyes, remember, a single seed can change the shape of a day. A flower at a bus stop can become a lighthouse for the tired and unnoticed. May your dreams tonight be gentle, golden, and full of blooming things. Good night.